Chapter 1. Astronomer's Magical Moonscript. On a warm summer night, as the evening sky began to change into the darkness of night, stars began to wink into existence in a rapid staccato. Already visible in the eastern sky, glowed the full moon, slowly rolling itself above the tree line. Nights with full moons shook Brox with enthusiasm, and, as such, he greatly looked forward to them, kicking off such evenings with a typical gnomish meal. Brox slowly consumed a hot bowl of double-thick porridge with a wooden spoon whose handle had been carved into the shape of a white rabbit with two huge buck teeth. On a ridiculously large plate, with a painting of bundles of sheaves of grain, sat 24 wafers. Each of these had a thick spread of bunny, a traditional spread of gnomes, consisting of butter and honey plus a dashes of sundry spices. Most importantly, the gnome had a full flagon of berry budge. After completing his meal, Brox made the trek up the 119 iron-wrought spiral steps to his observatory, anticipation of seeing the full moon washing over him. The observatory contained a score of star maps plastered to the wall, an oversized brass telescope, sitting on a wooden tripod, and the customary mobile hanging from the ceiling, showing the sun, all of the planets, and their moons. To the casual observer, everything appeared worn and droopy, even the stool behind the telescope appeared to sag. All of this, however, proved very typical of gnomish workmanship. They liked everything to have a snug, worn, comfortable look to it. "Well, let's see what the moon has to show us tonight," said the gnome to himself. Gnomes are notoriously known for talking to themselves. Brox opened one of the observatory's windows and scooted the telescope toward the open aperture. After pushing a little desk on wheels over to the telescope, he placed a piece of drawing paper on top of it so he could draw the landscape of the moon in detail. Tonight is a perfectly clear night. This should go well. He sat down on the stool, made a few adjustments, and gazed through the telescope at the moon. The moon appeared a little out of focus. He adjusted a knob on the telescope to bring the celestial object into sharp view. However, the moon refused to come into focus. It looked slightly blurry, the way things appear blurry when one looks through the bottom of a thick drinking glass. Brox sat back and blinked his eyes and then gazed through the telescope, again. Blurry. The gnome tried adjusting the knob on the telescope once more while muttering to himself, "I must have overcompensated." No improvement. Everything scaled through different degrees of blurriness. He could see the moon's craters with their valleys and mountain peaks around the rim, but they all just sort of ran together in a nondescript fashion like quicksilver on a cloth towel. He worked with the telescope for over an hour before finally giving up. Tomorrow I'll have to take it apart and see what's wrong. I still have my moonscripts. I'll just read those tonight. He refused to let a faulty telescope sap the night's enjoyment, so he went about salvaging his plans by pulling out 3 scrolls written in Moonscript. Moonscript was not a style of writing but a special ink made with a rare dye, called lunar shade, which could only be read under a full moon. Propping his feet up on the small desk, he held up the first scroll and began to read. It was a classic gnomish tale entitled Bishi Brumbok's Fixture. Even though he had read this story numerous times, he chuckled at some of the incidents in the story as though reading them for the first time. Also, his eyes widened in fear as he read other parts. After finishing this, he rolled up the scroll and slipped it back into its leather case. The second scroll written in Moonscript consisted of a list of growing techniques to produce large harvests of berries, red apples for spring cider, and wax of bug bucks, a distilled grass oil mixed with granite dust. Gnomes smear this wax around the baseboards of a house to keep insects out. The last part of the scroll had references to druidic magic. Even though most gnomes understood only illusionary magic, Brox understood this type, too. After putting away the scroll in its leather case, the gnome held the last one up to the moonlight. This faded scroll was considered not much fun by gnomes. It consisted of an endless parade of miscellaneous, and useless, facts from history. For example, it would make reference to the Cliver clan wars, but it did not say who the Cliver clans were, nor did it say when and where these wars took place. Reading this scroll always ended up a complete drudgery. Therefore, Brox only glanced at it. He quickly scanned the assorted names and events. As he put the scroll away, the moonlight fell upon 3 words at the bottom of the scroll, 3 words that Brox had never seen before. What's this? The gnome adjusted his spectacles and leaned forward, reading the words aloud. Doughty. Berek. Graben. As soon as he read the words, he felt something shift out of place. The sensation felt unnatural, sharp, cold, calculating, astringent. It raced from the top of his observatory, down into the burrow, and back up. A snap of Arctic air rushed around him, instantly making his fingers go numb, forming frost on his unicorn cape buckle, and freezing solid the berry budge in the flagon he held. He sat there a very, very long time, and not because he had frozen in place, he found himself too scared to move. He had the odd feeling that the words he had read were not meant for him. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Concealed in a grove of broadleaf white oak trees and a few patches of centipede grass, there nestled the Wooden Candle, the only tavern in Rustic Haven. The countrified building consisted of logs stuck together by a tar mortar and whitewashed for appearance, the whitewash making no appreciable difference, since a tangled mass of honeysuckle vines and glacier ivy covered everything except the windows. In front of the building sat a large stone step and a black iron post with a sign hanging from it. Someone had gingerly painted on the sign a half-wheel of cheese, a mug, and a loaf of bread. Inside, the owner and his wife moved about refilling mugs with burnt cider, berry budge, and their own infamous beverage called Blitzmore, a combination of double-thick coffee, nectar, and a rare fiery spice known as Festi. The 2 of them weaved through the barrel-shaped chairs as they moved from one table to the next. Since the light from the fireplace failed to reach all of the corners of the room, several oil lamps had been placed around the room to give off flicking waves of yellow light. Under one of these oil lamps sat Brox, mulling over what he had read the night before. Earlier in the evening, he had been outside, helping some small children collect acorns. Now inside, he looked out a large circular window, watching the faint outlines of rolling clouds in the nighttime sky as they raced behind the sagging branches of a weeping willow. A roar of laughter from a mingling group of dwarfs and gnomes at a nearby table diverted his attention. He observed them for a moment, wondering what comic episode of someone's life sent them into such an upheaval of rumbling chortles. Dwarfs sometimes visited the tavern, having come down from their gold mines in the mountains to the east, looking for a night of rip-roaring tales. Behind this table lounged an individual who appeared to be huge, his head almost brushing the ceiling. Actually, he was of normal build for a man, just he looked huge, residing in a building built for gnomes. Brox recognized him as a merchant that occasionally passed through Rustic Haven. Men rarely entered the Wooden Candle due to their height, so he mused at this curiosity for a moment. Brox had made his way down to the tavern the day after his episode in the observatory, hoping that he would learn a fragment of information as to the meaning of the words Doughty, Berek, and Graben. Usually, he got quiet stares when he asked for their definition. Most gnomes thought that he was leading into a tall tale, and they would stand waiting for him to continue with this yarn. When they realized his serious tone, they would shrug and suggest that he get a flagon of Blitzmore and join them in a round of Dareth, a game similar to darts. Near lunchtime, he did run into a visiting gnome illusionist. This spellcaster hailed from Bender Bowes Meadow, one of the 3 gnomish villages in the valley, located just beyond the Tipback River. No, the illusionist had never heard of the words Doughty, Berek, and Graben. He thought that the word Graben might deal with tombstones, since he had heard of a similar word in an archaic spell that came from the school of night magic. Nevertheless, the illusionist had added, spells from the school of night magic had not been cast in over 8 centuries. Therefore, the knowledge to cast this particular spell would have, in all likelihood, been lost. The conversation had ended along with the last few drops of Blitzmore. Whereas Brox qualified as a very academic astronomer, and the best among his race, he was better known for his vintage gnomish plant magic of a druidic nature. Therefore, when the door to the Wooden Candle opened and someone started to approach him, he reckoned that his visitor would wish for a plant tonic, such as vast harvest or weed demise, to increase a yield of crops or wither unwelcome plants. To his surprise, the individual coming toward him was a shortling, an unlikely candidate for either tonic. It was even more rare to find a shortling in the Wooden Candle than the full-grown man. Shortling height proved a peculiarity when compared to halflings, a distant cousin of theirs. Halflings stood slightly shorter than gnomes. However, shortlings stood even shorter than halflings. The individual never slowed in his approach toward the gnome. Brox wondered why a shortling would come to Rustic Haven. He felt a solid jolt of surprise when the shortling pulled back the hood on his cape. Thistlethorn? Brox asked, not because he did not recognize the shortling, but because he did not expect to see the other. Who were you expecting? The elven King Virax Triouth, Crown Emperor. And defender of the Graf Mistian, the tiny man scoffed. Thistlethorn stood just a notch under 3 feet tall with his jet-black hair, slicked back to reveal a sharp widow's peak. The sable cloak which covered an ochre-colored shirt and muddy russet pantaloons implied a roguish aspect. Shortlings, like halflings, usually went barefooted, regardless of terrain or even the bitter coldness of a harsh winter. However, Thistlethorn had spent many years in different human cities and had acquired a taste for wearing boots. Therefore, he sported a pair of polished black leather boots, to which his pantaloons were tucked in from the knees down. Of course not. The gnome majestically waved his hand toward the empty stool across from him. Then he readjusted his spectacles before continuing, "Please, good sir, join me." "Thank you." The shortling climbed onto a pine chair that tilted a bit unevenly. "I am surprised, but very glad, to see you." The two shook hands before the gnome continued. "What brings you to Rustic Haven?" "I just left an underground dwarven town, after completing some minor business which included delivering a map." The shortling contracted himself out as a cartographer, not just of cities and roads, but of underground complexes such as caves and dungeons. Brox glanced over at the dwarfs that guffawed with tall tales. "No, not dwarfs of the Stormpeak clan from the east," said Thistlethorn as he noted the crest on the hat of one of the dwarfs. "From the south." "Millabouts?" "Yes, the Millabouts clan," he answered while putting his head down on the table as if he slept from excessive tediousness and monotony. "They are the most blasted boring clan of dwarfs." He gave a mocking yawn and sat back up. "I had been there only an hour. In that small space of time, 3 of them showed me their rock collection. Not well crafted, gold figurines nor rune encrusted armor, like other dwarfs show guests. They showed me rocks. Blasted boring rocks. And not very colorful ones, either." His last statement sounded so loud that several individuals from other tables now looked at him, including all of the dwarfs. "Millabouts," yelled one of the dwarfs. Thistlethorn nodded his head. A roar of laughter and finger-pointing at the shortling followed from several of the dwarfs. The dwarfs made fun of his encounter with the Millabouts, but they pitied him at the same time. Thistlethorn smiled and nodded at the understanding dwarfs as they turned back to their own conversation. The shortling spoke. "I wasn't about to spend the night there and be subjected to their rambunctious, lively, social life. Who knows, they might have invited me to a boulder-breaking contest or a pebble toss. Anyhow, after catnapping for a couple of hours, I left there yesterday afternoon and came here." The gnome quickly calculated the traveling time, determining it quite hefty. "Did you stop at an inn or camp along the road?" "There are no inns between here and there. As for camping, there were too many small bands of goblins wandering the area. In fact, I saw 3 groups of them. Fortunately, I was able to slip into the shadows and hide until they passed by." The gnome stared at him. "You haven't slept since you left?" "I was able to get another catnap on the ferry ride across the Tipback River. They took nearly an hour to load and cross. Someone had a bunch of trepid cows and couldn't get them to board the ferry." Thistlethorn became silent as Brox told the owner of the wooden candle to bring his friend a woodcutter's soup bowl and a flagon of burnt cider. The man said something about the selection of spices that accompanied the meal and then returned to the kitchen. "After crossing the Tipback River," continued Thistlethorn, "I managed to get a ride from a local on the back of a wagon filled with wood until I reached Rustic Haven. From there, I made my way to your house." He changed the subject slightly. "I noticed that you lined the path to your burrow with blue billows and dark green parsley." He said this last statement as he moved his hand to indicate one walking down a path. When I didn't find you up in your tower, peering through that preposterous brass telescope of yours, I came looking for you down here." The gnome raised an eyebrow. "You imply that you managed to get inside. How did you do that?" "The front door to my burrow is locked, and there is a simple shocking spell on the door to discourage those that would try to open it without a key, and I know that you don't have a key." Thistlethorn smiled at the idea that a person always needed a key to get inside. "True, but that was of no concern. You left a window open in the observatory." "The observatory?" The gnome sat back in his chair, pointing upward. As the reality of the other's words sank in, he shook his head in disbelief. "Surely, you didn't." "Well, I did," replied the shortling as he shrugged. "You climbed the observatory?" Brox's jaw had dropped in astonishment. "But that's 51 feet up." "How?" "I climbed up one of your sugar maples. That got me over halfway. I jumped off one of the boughs onto that ledge you have and then climbed the rest of the observatory the old-fashioned way, working my fingers into little cracks and setting my feet on small outcroppings. That's dangerous." The shortling just looked at the gnome and nodded nonchalantly in agreement. A moment later, the owner returned with a steaming woodcutter's soup bowl and a flagon of burnt cider for Thistlethorn. The shortling, also, received a plate with 2 wedges of sharp cheddar cheese and half an apple on it. To the gnome's delight, he himself received a couple of slices of hot bread with a spread of strawberry marmalade on one and a sauce made from mangoes on the other. The two of them sat in silence, Thistlethorn quickly devouring his meal and Brox taking one small bite at a time. The shortling had stated how he normally liked being in snug taverns, however, tonight he would rather be elsewhere due to his exhaustion. When they were done, they both left some silver nobles on the table and departed for the gnome's burrow. ****. The two old friends now sat comfortably in wicker rocking chairs, telling stories of the events that had occurred in their lives since they had last met. Brox's feet were propped up on a cedar wood coffee table, and he listened intently to Thistlethorn as he nodded, laughed, and took hefty swigs of berry budge. "So, I arrived at the village of Dropdown and found a wooden fence running right through the middle of Main Street, mind you, not around the village for protective measures against marauding bands of orcs, but through the center of the village. The entire place was split into 2 armed camps. Fortunately, they were not armed with halberds and crossbows but with rotting eggs and molding tomatoes." The gnome set his flagon of berry budge on the end table next to him. Folding his arms, he asked, "Armed camps? What were they fighting over?" "Excalibur," puffed the shortling. "Or, more to the point, the story behind it. Half of the villagers claimed that the sword was pulled out of the stone by King Arthur. The other half said, no, he got it from the Lady of the Lake. They were in a bitter feud over which legend was true and had taken." He had to stop speaking as Brox's colossal grandfather clock gave a series of ear-piercing chimes that were followed by a dozen thunderous bonks at the stroke of midnight. The noise caused the paintings on the wall and the dishes in the china cabinets to rattle. "How do you sleep with all of that racket?" The gnome acted as if casting a spell, moving his hand and fingers in a quick wave. "Each night I cast deep silence on the clock. That prevents it from making any noise till after sunrise." The shortling rolled his eyes. Only a gnome would build a clock that required magic to let one sleep. He continued his story. And had taken sides to the point of splitting the entire village in half. After the fence had gone up, neither group would do business with the other. In fact, they would look over the fence and talk about the trees and wild flowers on the other side, even though their whole view was that of a house sitting no more than 10 feet in front of them. They flat out denied the existence of the other half of the village. I had heard that the village of Dropdown had some unusual residents, but this is beyond all common sense. The gnome just shook his head in grim understanding. "So, did you help them?" A thin smile flashed across Thistlethorn's face. "As a matter of fact, I did. I told them that the first time that King Arthur got Excalibur, he had pulled it from the stone. However, the sword had broken when fighting the Black Knight and had to be given to the Lady of the Lake. After it was mended, she gave it back to King Arthur. Therefore, both sides of the village were right." "Is that the real history of Excalibur?" asked the gnome. It is according to Mahon MacLeod, sage of the lower moors. Brox nodded at this. Mahon MacLeod had long proved well versed in all of the ancient legends of royalty. Anyhow, when they heard that, the fence was torn down between the two halves of the village within an hour and the people resumed their interactions. If you had shown up at that time, you would not have known that the whole matter had even existed. The gnome looked utterly perplexed at their rapid turnaround, but he accepted it with a shrug. I assume that you were considered a hero for ending such a ridiculous feud. Not at all. The gnome sat upright. Why not? At that time, I felt the way you do now. I thought that the feud was ridiculous. Therefore, when they asked me my opinion on what they should do with all of the wood, which was piled up at the outskirts of the village as a horrible eyesore, I asked them how long the pile was. They said, 136 feet. I told them that they should build a sailing ship that was twice that length, 272 feet. My words were obviously sarcastic in response to their ridiculous feud. I didn't know that there was a body of water within 5 miles of drop down. And you are correct. There isn't. Remember, I was being sarcastic. I stood there for a full quarter of an hour, telling them the benefits and profits to be made by trading with other communities, using a sailing ship. I told them that they could load the boat right here and then sail off to Cawsmill of Fender, sell their goods, and come back with a tidy profit. When they asked how the boat would sail across the ground, I told them that such a problem was a minor technicality and could be ironed out later. I suggested that they sail the boat when it was raining, especially heavy downpours. Raining? Yes. To my astonishment, they asked me to explain my thinking. I told them that boats float in the water, and, if it rained, that the whole boat would be wet, and they could sail at that time. He paused. The next morning there was a heavy rapping sound at my door. Armed militia men and one of the village elders escorted me to the South Road and told me that I was crazy, because, according to their diligent inquiries into the famed book Scientia for the non-intelligentsia and academically baffled, befuddled, and bewildered, boats don't float in the rain. Even heavy downpours. I was asked to leave as 2 of the militia men leveled their heavy crossbows on me. This I did most gladly. The 2 sat quietly for a moment. That was, a light tap came from the gnome's front door, an interesting, several very faint taps, story. More taps came from the door. Most of them emitted noise so faint in nature that they sounded like nothing more than someone brushing a cloth on the door. Who would be here at this late hour? Asked Thistlethorn. I readily can say that I do not know. The gnome stood up, glancing at his nearly empty flagon of berry budge. I guess that we should find out. The 2 little men walked over to the front door. By the time that they had reached it, there pattered a continuous dissonance of soft scraping noises on the door. The 2 perplexed men looked at each other, a hint of caution in their eyes, but not over concern. Do you think that something will rush in and attack us? Asked the shortling. In my lifetime, I have never known a living creature to willingly attack anyone in Rustic Haven. Gnomish magic in the land helps keep the peace. I am more prone to think that it is a practical joker. Thistlethorn nodded his head as Brox opened the door a crack to peek outside. As soon as the door opened 2 inches, a flood of moths came pouring in, fluttering about in twitching erratic patterns. The gnome, caught off guard, did not close the door. Instead, he instinctively stepped back, swatting at the moths. This permitted the door to slowly swing open on its hinges, allowing more moths to stream in. Thistlethorn instinctively reacted to this swelling problem. He leapt forward, slammed the burrow's door, and, in the process, crushed scores of moths between the door and the door frame. Hundreds of moths filled the burrow's foyer, and each one seemed to have one purpose: fly at the gnome, land on him, and bite him repeatedly. Being the center of attack, Brox grabbed a dark red cape off a peg in the wall and flailed it around, smacking moths. Thistlethorn jumped into the melee, swatting down the intruders and grinding them into the ground with his boots. This frantic struggle lasted for 2 full minutes until only an enormous, dirty brown moth, with a wingspan over 6 inches, remained. Brox had hit it twice with the cape, but it kept flying around. He started to hit it again when the dexterous shortling caught the massive moth in mid-flight with the tip of his dagger, skewering the moth and pinning it to the wall where the bladed weapon became embedded. The moth's wings fluttered thrice and then stopped. The two of them scanned the foyer for several moments, looking for moving moths. When they saw none, they stared at each other in silence with very frightened looks on their faces. What? Brock started to ask a question, but Thistlethorn cut him off. We can figure out the what later. The shortling glanced one more time at the massive moth still pinned to the wall before turning to Brox. Let's deal with those bites you have. The gnome had dismissed the pain from the bites during the conflict, but now that they were out of harm's way, he could focus on the pain rushing over him. He had received a total of, as determined by a later count, 153 bites. With the exception of one on his back from a moth that had climbed down his shirt, every bite was on his face, neck, and arms. Thistlethorn, using Brox's little alchemy lab, prepared a homemade antiseptic from ground up. Nightgloom roots, rice gibberellins, and auxins from some heartwood tree that he could not name. He mixed all of this with a bit of copper dust and several drops of vinegar. Brox applied a tiny amount of the antiseptic to his wounds. After a slight burning sensation that killed any infection, he felt better. Let's go have a look at those intruding insects, said Thistlethorn, making his way back toward the foyer. They looked a bit odd to me, especially that big brown one. Looked a bit odd, asked Brox, following the other. All I know is that they attacked me and ignored you. The fact that they attacked at all was strange. The fact that they only attacked you is even stranger. The two of them began to examine the moths. Neither one wanted to touch them, so they pushed the moths around with little sticks Brox used to kindle the fire in his fireplace. The moths looked like normal moths in the sense that they were fuzzy and consisted of the typical color mixture of shades of brown and gray with black highlights. Yet, something odd about them did exist. They had missing legs, broken antennae, and crushed wings. At first, the two of them had concluded that the damage had occurred in the melee. In time, Thistlethorn noticed something else. I don't think that all of this damage to the moths came from us. The shortling spoke in a quiet tone. What do you mean? We may or may not have been responsible for the damaged body parts. Note this. He pointed to a light gray moth that had two big black dots, that looked like dead eyes, on the wings. This one only has 2 legs. Where are the other legs? Perhaps they are on the floor, said Brox, unsure of the shortling's point. I looked for them but did not find any. Do you see any? The other scanned the floor and then shook his head no. That's right. The shortling held up one finger. A single moth missing legs would be of no consequence. But notice that there are several other moths missing legs. And these, he pointed to a few others, have broken antennae. Look at how many have crushed wings. Brox added an observation. Others have wings with holes in them. A lot of body parts are simply gone. Yes, said Thistlethorn. Now, notice that we don't see any of the missing parts. The gnome began to draw a picture of the other's point. As if they have been dead for a while and were already decaying. Exactly. Thistlethorn stood up and pointed at the enormous dirty brown moth pinned to the wall. This one is flat out missing its head, there are decay holes in its wings, and look at this. He pointed to the abdomen. The gnome gasped. It looks like it has been half eaten. Therefore, said Thistlethorn slowly, they were already dead before they got here. Zombie moths, whispered the other. The two little men could feel stabbing pains of fear in the back of their minds. Each staggered around the foyer for a moment in silence. Thistlethorn spoke. I have no idea who would want to send zombie moths into Rustic Haven, or, more specifically, why they would attack you. The gnome stared blankly at the skewered moth before responding. I don't know who, but I might know why. He turned toward a closet with some cleaning utensils in it. Help me sweep these up. Afterwards, we can talk about it. As they gathered a broom, a dustpan, and a bag, they noticed hundreds, or perhaps thousands, of moths plastered to the burrow's windows. The two inside could clearly see missing body parts, different stages of decay, and other signs that the moths had already died. This produced a chilling, nauseating effect on them, and they worked in a hushed quiet, cleaning up the mess. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Although back in their rocking chairs, they just sat there without rocking. Neither had spoken since they had started to clean up the remnants of the zombie moths. "All right," said Thistlethorn, fear no longer in his eyes. "I have been patient. What do you know?" Brox looked up, the light showing the red marks on his face where he had been bitten. "Last night, or perhaps 2 nights ago," he said, remembering that it was now after midnight, "I was in my observatory, looking at the moon as I normally do each time it is full." Thistlethorn listened carefully to every detail, paying extra close attention to the parts about the Moonscript and the words Doughty, Berwick, and Graben. When Brox finished his explanation, the 2 men sat quietly in their rocking chairs. An oil lamp hanging from the ceiling started to sputter as the last drops of oil were consumed. The gnome got up and refilled the lamp with a green-tinted kerosene. "You did not tell me what those words meant, so I am guessing that you do not know." The gnome replaced the kerosene in a metal cabinet before responding. "That is correct." Not only that, no one at the wooden candle had heard of those words, save the illusionist's minor conjecture. "So, we need to discover the meaning of those 3 words." Brox noticed that the other had said "we" and not "you." He felt genuinely appreciative of his friend's willingness to help. "My gratitude goes out to you for your support." Thistlethorn tapped his foot on the ground a few times to get the rocking chair in motion. "Well, I'm sure that you would have done the same for me. Anyhow, I am in no hurry to get back to Brookshire." The shortling spoke of his hometown. "There was talk of making me the sheriff. I have no desire of breaking up fights over corn prices, helping people find their lost dogs because they were too careless to put the creature on a leash, or attending every social event due to my community position of being sheriff." He thought about that last idea a moment before adding, "especially social events like potato digging contests and potato sack races." He smiled. "If I am gone long enough, maybe they'll think I'm dead and give the job to someone else." "One can only hope," said Brox, raising his flagon of berry budge in a mock toast. "What do you plan to do next?" He finished the last drops before answering. "On the morrow, I would like to set out for Derry." "Derry?" "That's a too-tall city." Too-tall was an expression used by gnomes and shortlings to refer to the race of men. "Will get kicked, stepped on, or knocked aside by the clumsy, lumbering, ungainly, gauche, maladroit citizens of Derry." Brox thoroughly understood Thistlethorn's warnings. Too Tall seemed to make it a habit of not watching where they walked. I know. He shrugged, pulled out a piece of boar jerky, offered some to Thistlethorn, who declined, and proceeded to rip a strip off. "I don't actually plan to go into the city limits. There is a bookseller on the other side of the river who has a huge assortment of archaic, obscure, and mostly unheard of publications, including pamphlets, compendiums, monographs, and codices. Maybe she will have something that can help us." As an afterthought, he added, "Her name is Caving Tun." Both of Thistlethorn's feet hit the ground at once, bringing the rocker to a full stop. "You mean Caving Tun the beheaded?" Brox pondered his friend's reaction, smiling. "Yes, Caving Tun the beheaded." Thistlethorn shook his head emphatically. "That crazy old lady is missing a few buttons upstairs. It is true that spending years with books and ignoring social interaction has made her a bit peculiar in character, but she does know a little something about almost everything." I do hope so." Thistlethorn changed the subject. "What about the zombie moths? Do you have any chervil and garlic? We could make a desiccative powder and try to drive them off. I have a bag of chervil in the pantry, but I store my garlic out in the shed. Anyhow, the zombie moths aren't goblins, smashing in doors with battering rams or breaking windows and throwing in burning torches. They can only come inside through open doors or open windows." When he said that, his eyes went wide open with fear. "The window in the observatory is open. I left it open after reading the Moonscript." Brox's mind filled with thoughts of thousands of zombie moths plastered to every square inch of the observatory, covering his furniture, mobile, notes, and, worst of all, his brass telescope. The shortling laughed at his friend's apprehension. "What shall I do?" asked a petrified Brox. "Relax," replied Thistlethorn, making the rocking chair go. "Relax?" Brox looked thunderstruck. "Yes, relax. I closed your window when I came in." Brox gave a thankful look. "Nasty creatures." "Enough of this gloom and doom chatter," said Brox. "Come here. I have something to show you." The two of them entered the parlor, an immaculate room that had the standard array of furniture and miscellaneous gnomish knickknacks. As they stepped into the room, Thistlethorn thought that he would be shown some painted wood carvings or a new clock, because gnomes habitually collected clocks. A simple glance around the room immediately revealed what Brox wanted him to see. Along the back wall, between two mahogany cabinets, loomed a massively oversized, grand pipe organ. With his eyes fixed on the instrument, Thistlethorn simply said, "A magnificent wonder." The pipe organ had two keyboards that curved around in a semicircular shape, consisting of a total of 176 keys of glistening ivory and ebony. Made of polished red oak, 24 pedals protruded from its base. 200 brass pipes rose from the back, each of a different diameter and length. There was a small cut in the ceiling to make room for the tallest two pipes. An array of stops could be pulled or pushed to allow the pipe organ to blend a variety of sounds together, including the harpsichord, lute, pianoforte, trumpets, and even kettle drums. Without waiting to be asked, Brock sat down, cracked his knuckles, and began to play. The magic of the music filled the room, and soon the two reeled in musical mirth and song-singing. Thistlethorn went and got the miniature Snowy Owl so it could sing along with them when they sang Canticle of Perseus. They sang over 24 songs before the weariness of the early morning hours began to take their toll, and they decided to turn in. They finished their singing with Medusa's Gaze, an old poem that had been set to music by the famous elven bard Terilyn, Lady of the Misty Forests.